Welcome to the Living Ageless and Bold podcast. Each episode, I bring you amazing women who inspire, educate, and share their experiences and journeys along the way. So grab a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, find a cozy spot, and let's relax and have some fun hearing what can be accomplished after 55.
Where do you think you'll be when you're 88 years old? Imagine becoming an author at 70, and then when you're almost 90, you decide to write your memoir. Well, that's my guest today, Mary Lou Dickinson. I'm so excited to have her. And it's really ironic that she was born during World War II, which they call the silent generation, where women were not supposed to speak up and not supposed to use their voices. And she's come a long way. And she loves pink like I do. So this is going to be an amazing interview. So welcome, Mary Lou.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for having me.
Well, you do take the record now as my oldest guest. So I'm just flattered to have you. I've had someone else in their 80s. To think of what you have lived through. So I definitely want to go back a little bit. You were born during World War II. Talk a little bit about your childhood and what it was like being a little girl during that time.
Well, it was interesting. My father actually went off to fight in the World War II when I was 5. So that was a big event that I remember that was very difficult because before that he was, my special daddy who read to me. And what was the question again?
I just want to know what life was like for you as a little girl growing up in that time. I have a daughter who's 25 and she grew up in a very different time with social media, and she's very strong and confident and, says what she wants, but that was not what I'm guessing what your childhood was like.
No, it was very, very different. Girls were not allowed to, or were not expected to be anything but teachers or nurses or secretaries. And I didn't want to be any of those things. So it was very difficult. It was hard to convince parents, for instance, because they were going along with the zeitgeist of the times. So And whenever I remember my father saying that he had a wheel. I didn't know what the heck that was, but he had a wheel and it was divided. There were 3 of us between the 2 girls and the 1 boy. So the 2 girls were to get the same as the boy. And I said as a child, well, that's not fair. And girls are just as good as boys. Now, I didn't know until much later that he actually changed his will, but I found that daughters seem to have an impact on their fathers. I've noticed it with my own father, my own daughter with her father, and you may have noticed that too.
Yes.
It's quite interesting. They don't listen to their wives often.
But their daughters.
Yeah.
So you grew up, so you're supposed to be a teacher or something along those lines, but I feel like you had a little bit of rebellious spirit in you that you were going to change the world. So what did you do? Did you go to college?
Yes, I did. I went to McGill University in Montreal. Mm-hmm. And when I went into the courses there, I was put in science because I hadn't taken Latin. And I was sitting in physics and chemistry, sort of totally baffled and knowing I didn't want that. And I finally convinced the university to let me take arts. And they said, you have to take Latin. And well, that was great because I wanted to take Latin. I loved university. I'd been in a boarding school for a couple of years, which I hated. And McGill was just so refreshing. Lovely city to be in as well, Montreal. I hadn't been there before I went to McGill. I grew up in a small mining town up north, which was considered a frontier town at that point. My mother had to go out for my birth. She had to go out in a little bush plane. She had to go back in a little bush plane. It wasn't until I was much older that the train, well, I shouldn't say much older, the train connection was built and you could get in by road, but that wasn't the case when my parents went in. It was quite an unusual situation for a child, I think. But I loved it. It's what you're used to.
That's all you know. And I read that it was a gold mining town.
That's right.
So what was that like?
Well, what was that like? People went in to make their fortune, right? Not my father. My father didn't, I don't think he imagined that he'd make the millions that some people thought. He went in, he was an engineer, a mechanical engineer, also a graduate of McGill. And he went in to design the head frame and the hoist and the underground, the setup so you could get underground and bring the minerals up from underground. So it all seemed pretty, mysterious to me, although I can remember seeing the gold being poured into bricks and things like that. I did work in an assay lab in a mine near there, but it wasn't a gold mine, so the processes were quite different. I worked there as a teenager, and I worked shifts during the summers for 2 or 3 years. And the person who trained me couldn't speak English, so I had to learn French. By the end of the first summer, I was dreaming in French. I used to go out to the mine on the shift bus with all the men with their lunch pails, because the mine was a few miles out of town. That one was a lead, zinc, and copper mine, but both the mines in Bourlamaque and Val-d'Or, where I grew up, were gold mines. And yes, there were a lot of people there who thought they were going to make a lot of money. Some of them did.
I was going to say, did anyone hit it big?
Yeah, I think so. They weren't people I knew, so I don't know. People also played the stock market quite a lot, so some people did quite well on the stock market.
Wow. This is just fascinating for me to have these conversations with you, to think, it was such a different time. And I remember talking to my grandmother who lived during World War II in Berlin, Germany.
Yeah.
So it's just the stories, like for people listening and watching, to think about, wow, they didn't have a train. They didn't have access to, if I didn't have cars, you didn't.
So much has changed, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you so you went to McGill and you finally were able to do some arts, and eventually you wrote books in your 70s, but you had a pretty storied career in terms of what you did for helping women, abused women.
Yeah, that actually was later. It was the longest job I did. I was divorced in the 70s when my children were 12 and 8, and I didn't want support for myself, but I got support for the kids. And I went back to university and I took a degree in library science because I was very interested in the information that people could get about how to cope. I wasn't as interested in all the other stuff, but I had to study it and it was useful. My first job was as something called the Resource Office Supervisor at the Community Information Center of Metropolitan Toronto. So it provided information 24 hours a day for the metropolitan area. It doesn't exist now. It's now managed by the City of Toronto under something like a number like 311 or 211. But they took over what the agency was doing. I worked there for 3.5 years. That was my first job after I was divorced. And I decided after that amount of time that I was going to quit and write. I was sitting on a beach. It took me about 7 days to decide. But I had a small grant and I thought I could probably manage on what I'd saved for 2 years. I ended up taking longer than that, and I wrote a couple of novels, neither of which were published at that time. And when I did a lot of part-time work on the side, like one thing which always interests people is I indexed the bylaws for the City of Toronto at the time. I was told only to index them. I wasn't to tell people what they should get rid of or update. So I didn't, but I always remember the one where it said no cows on Yonge Street being the main artery in Toronto. And that was quite amusing, but they weren't going to take it off the books. I'm trying to remember when I worked with the Assault Women's Helpline was the last job I had. I went to France for a couple of months. And when I came back, I thought I felt somewhat isolated and that I needed both to earn money and to have a community. So I was taken on there and I worked there for 15 years. And I did the crisis line, which was 24 hours a day. And I also, at some point, with another woman, handled their resources and training. And that was, I think, because of the degree I had. So it proved to be useful in its own way, not library so much.
That had to have been an emotionally difficult job to deal with that, or was it satisfying that you knew you were helping women?
No, it was very satisfying. I'd done a little bit of volunteer work before that on the distress line. So I was familiar with listening to people. And it's amazing how much listening helps people. I had to do training to do the work on the helpline because it's different. You need to know the resources and you need to be able to give people information as well as listen and understand them. But I found that there was a sort of a support system there among the counselors. Obviously, it was confidential information, but you could talk with each other after calls and debrief if you needed to. I can't remember who it was, but there was somebody who probably a supervisor with whom you could talk about really difficult calls. So that really helped. But to answer your point about it being difficult, when I decided that I was going to retire, and I was 65 then, and I thought I'm going to make sure I get a book published now. It'll take about 5 years. I remember shortly after I left thinking, I never want to help anybody ever again. I got over
I've done enough.
Yeah, exactly. I did get over that. But, for about a year, I just didn't want to. And I didn't realize how much it impacted me because at the time I had coping mechanisms and the calls were difficult, but you felt like you'd help somebody.
Right. Wow. Yeah. What a rewarding career knowing.
Yeah.
I would say with the podcast, if we could just help one person, and you had 15 years of helping women. So good for you. That's amazing.
Thank you. Seems like a long time ago now.
Well, I know. And it's just amazing that, oh, you're not old. Look at you. You're gorgeous and you're vibrant. And this is just an amazing conversation. So you retire at 65, and then do you go back to that book that you wrote, or is that the first book you published at 70, or did you come up with something new?
Well, I decided to look at what had not been published and what mattered the most to me. And there was one novel that did. It wasn't, in fact, the first book published. The first book published was a collection of short stories called One Day It Happens. But that was important to me too. But the novel came about, I can't remember, a year or two after that. And it was called Ile d'Or. And so many people had asked me about this town I'd come from and didn't know anything about this sort. I think a lot more people know now, but they didn't know anything about the sorts of things that happened there. Like, for instance, a local nightclub was built on high-grade gold, which means that somebody stole the gold and left the mine to build the nightclub. And, nowadays they have far greater detection methods, and I don't think that sort of thing happens, although I'm sure there's still people who are trying to high-grade. But, so that novel sort of was part of my soul. I felt like I needed to do it. And it was the next book that was published.
And when you say a novel, so it was just a story about somebody living in this town that you grew up in, or was it about a gold miner?
It was about two people who had gone back to the town, sort of seeking things that they didn't know what. And there were two people who lived there. So the four of them become the main characters in a way. And they all come to some sort of reconciliation before the end of the novel. I'm trying to remember it.
It was many books ago.
It's a while ago, a few years ago too. Yeah. But, my first published piece was at age 6 when my grandmother published a poem in her column, and she had a food column in the Toronto Telegram, which was a newspaper in Toronto that was circulated quite widely. We used to get it up north. And she would have recipes in her column, but she also always had a lead in and told stories. For instance, she went to Hollywood in the 50s and interviewed some of the stars, and they seemed to love her, and she certainly loved telling the story and showing pictures of herself with them in her columns. But in any case, she published this poem of mine, and the publisher wrote to me and sent me $5, which seemed like a lot of money then.
I'm sure.
So I'm sure that influenced me. I didn't think so at the time or later, because my grandmother was kind of an old codger and sort of difficult for the family to get along with. And I just wanted to reject everything she'd done. But as time went on, I realized that she'd been an important influence.
I was just going to ask you, because to be a writer at that time, and, to a columnist, I mean, granted it was food, which was probably okay to talk about cooking and recipes. Yeah. But I just wondered if she was an influence for you to see a strong woman.
Yeah, she was quite an incredible woman. She retired at, 70? And she bought herself a little white sports car, and she took up another job as a model of all things.
Wow.
So she couldn't help but be an influence of some kind. She didn't live in our town. She lived in Toronto, thank heavens, because she tried to guide everybody, and she never said anything. Like if I wore blue, she'd say, "You look really good in green," Oh. And if I said anything, she'd say, "Well, you can't take criticism." So she was quite difficult. But I think she was an important influence.
Wow. Isn't that funny? I think everyone has a family member like that. Just that little doing the little digs.
And when I found the poem that she'd published later, I thought, oh my goodness, this is so awful. I don't know why they published it. Maybe because I was only 6.
It's so funny you say that. My father worked for a big oil company and they had a newsletter and same kind of thing. They would talk about company stuff, but then so they did a photo contest and I had taken a picture of, it was, like a beautiful river in the fall, crisp blue sky. And I won the photo contest.
Oh, wow.
I think I won $20, which a few years later, but $20 was a lot of money.
It was.
And they posted a picture of me in it and same kind of thing. But I was like, this won a photo contest. What was your poem about? Do you remember?
Snow.
Okay. Was it a rhyming poem?
I don't know. I actually, when I read it again, I thought, this is so awful. I don't want to keep it. I don't think so. So I don't have it anymore.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So you're now 70. You've written, you're published.
I'm 87 now. Oh,
well, you're 87.
Yeah.
70. In the books.
Yeah.
So, right. And you've done a lot between 70 and 87. So four more books during that time. Let's talk a little bit about those. What inspired you to write them?
Well, I decided after the first book was published in the time frame that I had decided, and I'd done a number of things like take courses and join writing groups, that I'd have 3 more books by the time I was 80. And I did. There was another novel called Would I Lie to You? And then there was a mystery. Somebody challenged me to write a mystery. I didn't really read mysteries and I didn't know how to write one. And he said he would write it with me. But after the first meeting, he said he was too busy. But I was welcome to the idea as long as I acknowledged him later. So I struggled with that for a long time. I actually, it was read by a fairly prominent mystery writer in Canada who said I think I had an agent at that point who said to her, well, does she want to write a social novel or does she want to write a mystery? And I thought, well, I know I can write a social novel, but I want to write a mystery.
Right. So
I'll show you. I did. And it ultimately was published. And it seems to be probably because people read mysteries a lot. It seems to be the most popular of the books I've published.
Interesting. And I'm curious, at your age, what kind of technology did you use? Did you type them? Did you, a lot of people write their books, read or speaking into their phone and then having that transcribed and then writing their books. So I'm just curious, did you handwrite? How did you go about writing your books?
I think long ago, I used to handwrite, and my son, who's coming to visit soon, is going to teach me how to do the talking one.
Great.
I had worked, was it at the helpline? I seem to be the one who knew more about computers than most people. So when I stopped working to write, I was no longer doing longhand. And I actually now write on the computer. There are many functions I don't understand or use, but I do use the computer. Yeah. And I don't, the method you described, I'm looking forward to.
Yes.
Because my son says he goes for walks and he records. And when he gets back, he has it all right there. And I think, that would be great.
Yeah. Yes. Because you're working on your memoir, which we'll talk about in a minute, because that might really help you with that. So what was the name of the mystery book that ended up being your most popular?
The White Ribbon Man.
Okay.
It may be the only book that's completely set in Toronto, which may be why people here really like it. It's set in a downtown Toronto church, and a body is discovered in the church. So that's where it starts.
Okay. Great. All right. Let's talk about your memoir.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking it could be a very big book. You've lived an incredible life. So what inspired you to think that you needed to get everything down on paper?
That's interesting. I'm not absolutely certain, but in 1992, I went to the Banff Center for the Arts, and I was there for 6 weeks. And one of the things that I looked into when I was there was that when I was growing up, I heard a lot about Uncle Billy. And to me, he was more like a fictional character than a real person. But Uncle Billy was one of 3 men who, as a colonial settler, discovered the Banff Springs. He was a railroad worker. And so I went into the little shop in town and discovered things about him. Actually, I discovered that on an earlier trip through Banff with my family. But when I went back in 1992, I discovered that there was a manuscript in the White White Museum of the Canadian Rockies. And it was written by this man. It was a huge manuscript that had never been published. So I was able to read bits of it and extract from it and to think, well, this is interesting. I have an ancestor who was a real explorer. And that's in a way what I feel like sometimes. And later on, I discovered, not at Banff, but that I'm descended directly from Jacques Cartier, who was the first French settler in Canada. And so, it seemed to be something that drew together my thoughts on where I came from. I'm in a very small family at this point. Both my parents were only children. So I sort of felt wherever I was, I never had aunts, uncles, or cousins, and everybody else did, But suddenly I had these kind of interesting ancestors. So that's probably part of what motivated me, as well as the place I come from. Because people would, when they asked where I came from, they'd want to know about it. They want to know about what it was like. They'd never really heard. They may have now because, it's so many years later, but they wanted to know what went on in a gold mining town and why did my parents go there? And, what was it like for me growing up? And, I lived in a house next to the bush, for instance, and I would go out and sit on a rock near our house and imagine other worlds. And it was just so different.
What is your fondest memory of growing up in a gold mining town?
Oh, wow. My fondest memory.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not making this up. I like this, but I may think later of something else. There was a place called the Cookery where the men from underground ate all their meals. And when we went in there as children, Sam would always give us a treat. And apple pie was a real favorite. So I remember that very clearly. And I liked going around the mine with my father. He often took me on Sunday mornings and he'd describe what was going on in the different areas of the mine. Because at that point it was, it was all on surface and the gold mining went on underground. Now it's an open pit mine, that one is. And it wouldn't be nearly as interesting for a child. But
I was going to ask, do they still mine it?
They're still mining that mine. The other one that was very important in the area is not mining, as far as I know, and they do underground tours for tourists. And actually, that was an interesting experience. I was back at one point when an underground tour went by, a tour wagon with people in it, and some young teenager telling them about things. And I thought, oh my gosh, it doesn't sound authentic at all if you lived here. I mean, the facts were sort of real, but they do underground tours there, and they're certainly an important part of the town. In fact, there was an article in the Canadian Geographic recently, which I had to write them and tell them there were a lot of errors in it, but the town has become a historic town, and the other mine is the one that's highlighted. What really irritated me was they didn't even mention the mine my dad was at, and the two of them are really important mines at that point in time.
Interesting, yeah, so fascinating. So the memoir you're going to write. What else are you going to talk about in there?
Well,
what am I missing about your fabulous life?
Okay, well, it's written and it's going to be published soon. It's taken a long time to get it published because the publisher went under and they seem to have emerged. And if they'd done it 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been a lot easier for me physically. But what else is in it? I've traveled a fair bit, and the trips are always, if I have included them, they're connected somehow to storytelling and the memoir. Travel.
And talk about the title. I love what you named the book.
Late Bloomer.
Late Bloom.
Yes, I've discovered that it's not an unused title, but I gather you can reuse titles. Well, it's because my books came so late, and I was trying from the time I was 6 to be a writer, and the first book comes at 70. Now, I did have a number of short stories published over the years, and it's really sad to think that all my really wonderful mentors are now dead. But one of the ones that your audience may know, although all of them were Canadian, was Alistair MacLeod. And he wrote No Great Mischief, which won one of the big prizes. And he was just such a fantastic mentor because he was so human and so down to earth. And I remember thinking it was a 1-week course and we got to talk to the mentor. And when I went in, we both sat really quietly. And I thought, what am I supposed to say? And he said, well, I published 2 of your stories in the University of Windsor Review. And I said, I corresponded with whatever his name was. And he said, well, he was the editor. He would drop the stories on my desk. Anyway, when I left that that course, I always thought I would have to introduce myself to him when I met him. And I went to a number of his readings because he'd been so kind and I enjoyed his writing. And he was a wonderful performer when he went. And I can remember I'd be about to introduce myself and he would say, "Hello, Ildor," which was the title of my novel, which was so amazing. But he was a wonderful mentor. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but
no,
it's really apply.
And I was just thinking in my head, I hope you're going to do your book on tape or a voiceover, because your voice is just, I would love to listen to it.
Do you think I could do it?
Yeah. I think you should do it. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, it's okay. My son has offered to do an audiobook, but that one wouldn't be suitable for him because it needs to be a woman's voice. I think he could do the mystery, but I thought my daughter might be able to, and she has, she's done stuff and has a great voice. And I don't think my voice is always able to do it. And I've taken a couple of courses online about doing audiobooks. So if you think I could, I might try it.
I think you should try, because I think your voice and your passion and your storytelling is fabulous.
Thank you.
I really, really do. So I think, and I understand it. And I said books on tape. I'm dating myself a little bit on that audiobook. But yeah, I think if you could do it, I think it would be fantastic.
Well, great. When my son's here, I won't ask him to do it, but I'll ask him to help me with how to do it.
How to do it. Yeah. It's the book sounds fascinating. So what's next for you? You've got 5 books. You've written your memoir. You're not going anywhere. I mean, look at you.
No.
So,
well, I actually want to stop writing for publication, but I have 2 more things going. One is a short story collection, which is complete, and I've submitted that. And I'm working on a novel. I don't know whether I'll finish it or not, but if I do, what I want to do then is write poetry just for myself, not for publication. Mm-hmm. And if I manage to get more than 6 books with the novel and et cetera, I'll be quite satisfied. I'll be satisfied with 6 if that's what happens.
That's amazing. And you have to tell me what's with the pink. I love the pink. I love the pink hair.
Well, I've been wearing it for quite a long time. I don't know quite how I even have on pink shoes.
Oh, pink is a happy color. I love it. Look, everything I have around me is pink, 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 pink. So I do all pink.
More than I do.
Yeah.
I suddenly thought this morning, oh dear, I hope Christina won't mind that I'm in pink, but my hair's pink, so what can I do?
No, pink is my color. I love pink. It's a happy, happy
it looks
color.
Great on you.
Oh, thank you. So, Mary Lou, if you could go back in time and talk to your 40-year-old self who was, working the crisis hotline, what would you say to her with what you know now?
Well, probably do what I did after 40. I mean, I can remember feeling at 37 when I separated that my life had just suddenly opened up and had become free, that I could I had to look after my children. There were a lot of things I had responsibility for, but I had this freedom to, I had a marriage where the former husband was threatened by my writing. So that was very difficult. I could suddenly do what I wanted. Interestingly enough, years later, I got a letter from him saying he'd read my collection of short stories and they were like a string of precious jewels. And he always thought every character I was writing about before was him. And what he didn't recognize was some of the characters in the collection were him, but he was prepared to let that go at that point. Yeah, no, I guess I would say that at 40, I had made the right decision to set out on my own, that I should, I often say to myself, what was the big mistake I made? And the big mistake was marrying young and not marrying someone who supported who I was. But I wouldn't have the life I have now without the children and grandchildren I now have. So I don't feel really regretful. I just recognize that it was a path where I might have taken another one and reached my goals sooner. And would that have mattered really now?
Right. And it's interesting when you think about your life, and I'm almost 60. I do that too, but I wouldn't change anything because I wouldn't have my kids, and I don't have grandkids yet. I'm waiting.
My grandkids are quite young, some of them.
That's fine. How many do you have?
I have 3. The oldest one is turning 28, I think, on July 1st. Wow. He's in Taiwan learning Mandarin. The other 2 are 8 and 11. So my son was a late starter, but I'm having the joy of them. And
I was going to say that keeps you young, and they must love having a hip grandmother with pink hair. And how fun.
Well, we do have fun.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, Mary Lou, thank you for joining me today. All of your books, all your information, your website, everything will be in the show notes. And I just want to encourage, everybody watching and listening. If you need a little bit of inspiration, if you think you're stuck in your 50s or your 60s, it is never too late. Mary Lou is just the epitome of this, and share this episode with your friends so they can be inspired as well. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening or for watching this episode of Living Ageless and Bold. If you haven't already, please make sure you hit subscribe. And if you like the episode, I hope that you will give us a great review. You can also head over to livingagelessandbold.com and sign up for information, inspiration, and exclusive opportunities for us, women over 55. Thanks for listening. And remember, no matter what you do, keep living ageless and bold.